There is something quietly happening inside you, and you haven't noticed it yet. You still wake up, you still talk to people, you still go through your days like everything is normal. But something is missing, not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, silently. You are disappearing, not your body, not your name. You, the real you. And the most dangerous part is, you don't feel it happening. Because it doesn't hurt all at once. It fades, little by little, choice by choice, attachment by attachment, until one day you look at your life and you no longer recognize the person living it. In Buddhism, this is not a mistake, it is a warning. There is a quiet shift that happens within a person long before they realize anything is wrong, and it does not arrive with noise or chaos, but with a subtle softening of awareness, like a flame that slowly loses its brightness without ever going out completely. At first, everything appears normal on the surface. You continue your routines, you speak the same words, you respond to people in familiar ways, and from the outside, nothing seems to have changed. But within, something essential has begun to fade. Something that cannot be seen with the eyes, yet can be deeply felt when one becomes still enough to notice it. The Buddha taught that suffering is not always loud or dramatic. It does not always come as pain that forces you to stop and pay attention. Sometimes suffering is quiet. Sometimes it is the gradual disconnection from your own awareness, the slow forgetting of your inner clarity, the subtle movement away from your true nature without even realizing it is happening. You begin to live less consciously and more automatically, responding instead of observing, reacting instead of understanding. Your days start to blend into each other, not because life has lost meaning, but because you are no longer fully present within it. You are moving, but not truly living. You are speaking, but not truly expressing. You are existing, but not truly aware. In Buddhism, this state is often described as living in ignorance, not ignorance in the sense of lacking knowledge, but ignorance as a lack of direct awareness, a kind of inner sleep where you are no longer seeing reality as it is, and when awareness fades, the connection to your authentic self begins to weaken. This does not happen through one major mistake or a single wrong decision. It happens through small, almost invisible moments that seem harmless on their own. Each time you ignore your intuition, each time you silence your inner voice to please others, each time you choose comfort over truth, you take a small step away from yourself. At first, these moments feel insignificant. You tell yourself it is easier this way, that it avoids conflict, that it keeps things smooth and manageable. But what you do not see is that with every small compromise, you are slowly rewriting who you are. Not consciously, not intentionally, but gradually shaping yourself into something that feels more acceptable to the world while becoming less aligned with your inner reality. You begin to say yes when your heart wants to say no. You begin to stay in situations that quietly drain your energy because leaving would feel uncomfortable or uncertain. You begin to adapt your thoughts, your words, even your behavior to fit the expectations around you, believing that this is what is required to belong, to be understood, to be accepted. And over time, something subtle but profound begins to happen. The distance between who you truly are and who you present to the world starts to grow. It is not a dramatic separation, but a quiet widening gap that you rarely stop to examine. The Buddha emphasized the importance of right awareness, the ability to observe your thoughts, your actions, and your intentions without illusion. But when awareness is absent, you no longer see these shifts clearly. You simply continue moving forward, unaware that each step is taking you further away from your center. This is how losing yourself truly begins. Not through destruction, but through disconnection. Not through chaos, but through quiet neglect. It is the result of not paying attention, of not questioning, of not pausing to ask whether the life you are living still reflects the truth within you. And the most dangerous part is that this process feels normal. There is no alarm, no clear signal that something is wrong. Everything continues as usual, and because of that, you never think to stop and look deeper You assume that this is simply how life is supposed to feel, slightly disconnected, slightly unsatisfying, slightly incomplete. But deep within there is always a part of you that knows, a silent awareness that something is not fully aligned, that something essential has been set aside. It does not shout, it does not demand attention, but it remains there waiting for you to notice it. In Buddhist teaching, this inner knowing is not something you need to create. It is already present. It is your natural clarity, your original awareness before it became clouded by fear, attachment, and external influence. But to reconnect with it, you must first recognize how far you have drifted. And that recognition does not come through force or effort. It comes through stillness, through a moment of honest observation where you stop running, stop reacting, and simply look at your life as it is. Because the truth is, you have not lost yourself in a single moment. You have been slowly moving away, step by step, choice by choice, without realizing that each step mattered. And until you begin to see this clearly, the process will continue, quietly, gently, almost invisibly, carrying you further from who you truly are, while making you believe that everything is still the same. But it is not the same. Something has changed, and the moment you begin to notice it is the moment everything can begin to shift. After the first quiet disconnection begins, something even more subtle starts to take root within the mind, something the Buddha described as one of the primary causes of suffering, something so ordinary that most people never question it, yet so powerful that it quietly shapes the direction of an entire life. This is attachment, not just attachment to people, but attachment to identity, to expectations, to the idea of who you believe you are supposed to be. It does not appear suddenly, and it does not feel dangerous at first. In fact, it often feels comforting, like something that gives you stability, something that makes you feel secure in a world that is constantly changing. But what feels like stability can slowly become a cage. At the beginning, attachment shows itself in small ways. You begin to care more deeply about how others perceive you. You start to adjust your behavior, your tone, your reactions, not because it reflects your truth, but because it maintains a certain image. You become more careful, more calculated, more aware of how you are being seen rather than how you truly feel. And without realizing it, your life begins to shift from being internally guided to externally controlled. You begin to measure your worth through responses, through attention, through approval. You notice how people react to you, and you adjust accordingly. If something you say is accepted, you repeat it. If something you express is rejected, you hide it. Over time, this creates a version of yourself that is shaped not by truth, but by reaction. The Buddha referred to this as craving or tanha, not just the desire for material things, but the deeper craving for validation, for recognition, for a sense of identity that feels solid and secure. But the problem is that anything built on external validation is inherently unstable. Because people change, opinions shift, circumstances evolve, and when your sense of self depends on something that is constantly moving, you begin to feel unstable as well. This is where the deeper loss begins. You are no longer simply disconnected from your awareness. Now, you are actively constructing a version of yourself that is dependent on forces outside of your control. You are not only drifting away from who you are, but also attaching yourself to something that can never truly hold you. And the more you attach, the more you fear losing. You fear losing people, losing approval, losing the identity you have worked so carefully to maintain. And that fear begins to influence your choices in ways you may not fully recognize. You stay in conversations longer than you should. You remain in relationships that no longer align with your inner truth. You continue patterns that feel familiar, even when they quietly diminish your sense of self. Because letting go feels like losing something important. But what you are holding on to is not your true self. It is an image, a reflection shaped by expectation and reinforced by repetition. The Buddha taught that all things are impermanent, that everything you try to hold on to will eventually change, dissolve, or disappear. But when you do not understand this deeply, you continue to grasp, believing that if you hold on tightly enough, you can make something stable out of what is inherently unstable. And this grasping creates tension, not always visible, not always overwhelming, but always present beneath the surface. A quiet unease, a subtle anxiety, a feeling that something is not entirely right, even when everything appears to be in place. This is the suffering that arises from attachment. It is not always dramatic. It does not always announce itself, but it is there, shaping your experience, influencing your perception, guiding your actions in ways that slowly take you further away from your center. And the more you invest in this constructed identity, the harder it becomes to step back and question it, because to question it means to confront the possibility that what you have been holding on to is not real in the way you believed. It means facing the idea that much of what you present to the world is not an expression of your true nature, but a response to fear, to expectation, to the desire to belong. And that realization can feel unsettling. So instead of questioning, most people continue. They continue performing. They continue adapting. They continue reinforcing the identity they have built. And with each repetition, the attachment grows stronger. But so does the distance. The distance between who you truly are and who you believe you need to be becomes wider, more defined, more difficult to bridge. And eventually it reaches a point where you no longer remember what it felt like to simply exist without trying to maintain something. You forget what it means to act without calculation, to speak without filtering every word, to move through life without constantly adjusting yourself to fit into it. This is the deeper layer of losing yourself, not just forgetting, but replacing your natural awareness with conditioned patterns, replacing your inner truth with external expectations, replacing your presence with performance. And yet, beneath all of this, your true nature has not disappeared. In Buddhism, it is understood that your original awareness remains untouched, no matter how many layers are placed over it. It is not destroyed, only obscured. Like the sky hidden behind clouds, it is still there, unchanged, waiting to be seen again. But to see it, you must first recognize the attachments that are covering it. You must become aware of the ways in which you have shaped yourself to fit what is temporary, instead of aligning with what is real. You must begin to notice how often your actions are driven not by clarity, but by fear of losing something you believe you need. And this noticing is not immediate. It requires patience. It requires stillness. It requires the willingness to look honestly at your life without turning away. Because attachment does not reveal itself easily. It hides within habits, within routines, within patterns that feel so familiar that they seem natural. But when you begin to observe closely, you start to see the tension beneath them, the subtle discomfort that arises when you act against your truth, the quiet resistance that appears when you ignore your inner voice. And slowly, through this observation, something begins to shift. You start to realize that what you have been holding on to is not as solid as you believed. You begin to see the impermanence in everything you once thought was stable. You notice how quickly things change, how easily circumstances shift, how unreliable external validation truly is. And with that realization, a question begins to form within you. If everything I am holding on to is unstable, then what is truly mine? This question is the beginning of deeper awareness. It is the moment where you stop blindly attaching and begin to look more carefully at the nature of your experience. It is the moment where you start to loosen your grip, not because you are forced to, but because you understand that holding on is what creates the suffering. And in that understanding, there is the first glimpse of freedom. Not complete freedom yet, not a full release, but a subtle shift, a small opening where you begin to see that you are not defined by what you cling to, that your identity is not something that needs to be constantly protected or maintained, that perhaps what you truly are is something far deeper than anything you have been trying to hold together. And this realization, once it begins, cannot be easily undone. Because once you see the nature of attachment, once you understand how it has shaped your life, you can no longer return to complete unconsciousness. You have seen something real, something fundamental, something that begins to dissolve the illusion you have been living within. And from this point forward, the process changes. You are no longer just drifting. Now, you are starting to awaken. As attachment grows stronger and your identity becomes more dependent on what is unstable, something profound begins to happen within the mind itself. Something that is not immediately visible but slowly reshapes how you experience reality. Your mind, which once had the potential to be a tool for awareness, begins to turn into something else entirely. It becomes a place of constant noise. At first, this noise feels like thinking. It feels like you are being thoughtful, careful, aware of possibilities and outcomes. But over time, it becomes clear that this is not clarity. It is confusion repeating itself in different forms. It is the same patterns of thought cycling again and again, never leading to resolution, only deepening your sense of uncertainty. The Buddha described the untrained mind as restless, constantly chasing, constantly resisting, never at peace with what is present. And when awareness is weak and attachment is strong, this restlessness intensifies. You begin to overanalyze everything. Every decision feels heavier than it should. Every interaction carries more weight than it deserves. You replay conversations in your mind, not to understand them, but to judge them, to question them, to find meaning where there may be none. You imagine outcomes that have not happened, and you react emotionally to things that exist only in your thoughts. And slowly, without realizing it, you stop living in reality. You begin living inside your mind. This is where the deeper suffering emerges, because the mind, when left unobserved, does not simply reflect reality, it distorts it. It creates stories, assumptions, fears, and attachments that feel real but are not grounded in truth. And when you believe these mental constructions, they begin to shape your behavior, your emotions, and your sense of self. You start to believe things about yourself that are not truly yours. You start to see yourself through the lens of fear, through the lens of past experiences, through the lens of how others have treated you. And instead of questioning these perceptions, you accept them, you internalize them, and they become part of your identity. This is how the mind becomes a prison, not through force, but through belief. You are not physically trapped, but mentally confined within patterns that you do not fully understand. You feel restricted, limited, uncertain, not because reality is inherently that way, but because your perception of it has been shaped by unexamined thoughts. And the more you identify with these thoughts, the more real they become. The Buddha emphasized that thoughts are not the self, that they arise and pass, that they are not stable or permanent. But when you lose awareness, you stop seeing thoughts as temporary events, and you begin to see them as truth. You think something, and you believe it. You feel something, and you assume it defines you. And this identification creates a fragile sense of self, a self that is constantly shifting depending on what the mind produces, a self that feels strong one moment and broken the next, a self that is easily influenced, easily shaken, easily lost within its own internal world. And because this process is continuous, because the mind never truly stops, you rarely find peace. Even in moments of quiet, the mind continues. It replays, it anticipates, it worries, it imagines. It pulls you away from the present moment and into a space where nothing is stable, nothing is certain, and nothing is truly real in the way it appears. This is why you begin to feel disconnected, not only from yourself, but from life itself. Because you are no longer experiencing life directly. You are experiencing your interpretation of it, filtered through layers of thought, shaped by attachment, influenced by fear. And in this state, clarity becomes difficult. You struggle to understand what you truly feel because your thoughts are constantly interfering. You struggle to know what you truly want because your mind presents too many conflicting possibilities. You struggle to trust yourself, because your sense of self has become unstable. This is the deeper stage of losing yourself, not just disconnection, not just attachment, but confusion, a state where you are no longer anchored in awareness, no longer grounded in presence, but instead moving through a mental landscape that is constantly shifting and rarely clear. And yet, even here, there is something important to understand. The mind itself is not the problem. The Buddha did not teach that the mind should be destroyed or silenced completely. He taught that it should be understood, that awareness should be developed so that you can observe the mind without becoming lost within it. Because the moment you begin to observe your thoughts instead of identifying with them, something changes. You start to see patterns. You notice how certain thoughts repeat, how certain fears return, how certain narratives shape your perception again and again. And with this noticing, you begin to create a small but powerful distance between you and your mind. This distance is subtle at first. It may only last for a moment, a brief recognition that what you are thinking is not necessarily what is true. But even this small shift is significant because it introduces the possibility of freedom. Freedom not from thinking, but from being controlled by it. As this awareness deepens, you begin to see that much of what you have been believing about yourself is not fixed, not permanent, not inherently true. You begin to question the identity that has been formed through repeated thoughts, through past experiences, through external influence. And this questioning is not comfortable because it challenges what you have come to accept as real. It creates uncertainty where there was once assumed stability. It forces you to confront the possibility that the person you think you are is not as solid as you believed. But within this discomfort, there is also clarity, because as the illusion begins to weaken, something more authentic starts to emerge. Not a new identity, not something constructed, but a deeper awareness that is not dependent on thought. A sense of presence that exists before the mind begins to interpret, judge, or define. In Buddhism, this is the beginning of true insight. Not intellectual understanding, but direct seeing. Seeing that the mind creates suffering when it is not observed. Seeing that thoughts are temporary and do not define you. Seeing that the self you have been protecting is not as fixed as it appears. And with this seeing, the structure that once held you begins to loosen. The prison walls, which were never truly solid, begin to fade. Not all at once, not completely, but gradually, as awareness continues to grow. And for the first time in a long time, you begin to experience moments where you are not trapped within your thoughts, where you are simply present, simply aware, simply existing without needing to define or control anything. These moments may be brief, but they are real, and they are enough to show you that what you are seeking is not something outside of you, not something you need to build or achieve, but something that has always been there, waiting to be recognized beneath the noise of the mind. And once you begin to taste this awareness, even slightly, something within you shifts permanently, because you realize that the prison was never real in the way you thought. It was built from thoughts, maintained by belief, and dissolved through awareness. And from this realization, a new question begins to arise within you. If I am not my thoughts, then who am I? Really? And this question marks the beginning of a deeper awakening. After the mind begins to loosen its grip and you start to see that your thoughts are not as solid as they once appeared, another layer of illusion slowly reveals itself, one that is even more subtle, even more deeply rooted, and far more difficult to recognize. It is the illusion that you are in control. For most of your life, this belief has guided your actions without question. You make decisions, you plan, you choose paths, and it feels as though you are the one directing everything. It feels natural to assume that you are the center of your experience, the one who decides, the one who shapes, the one who controls the direction of your life. But when awareness deepens, this sense of control begins to feel less certain. You start to notice how many of your thoughts arise without your intention. You do not choose every thought that appears in your mind. They come on their own, shaped by past experiences, by memory, by conditioning, by influences you may not even remember. And yet you often take ownership of them as if they were consciously created. You begin to see how your emotions follow a similar pattern. A feeling arises before you have time to decide whether you want it. Joy, irritation, fear, desire, they appear, move through you and fade, often without your control. You may try to suppress them or hold on to them, but their nature is not fixed. They come and go independent of your efforts to manage them completely. And then you look at your actions, even your choices, which feel deliberate, begin to reveal layers beneath them. Why did you choose that path? Why did you say those words? Why did you react in that moment? When you examine closely, you begin to see that many of your decisions are influenced by patterns, by habits, by past conditioning, by subtle fears and desires that operate beneath the surface of conscious awareness. The Buddha pointed to this through the teaching of dependent origination, the understanding that everything arises due to conditions. Nothing exists independently. Nothing happens in isolation. Every thought, every feeling, every action is the result of countless causes and conditions interacting in ways that are too complex to fully grasp. And when you begin to see this clearly, the idea of a fixed, controlling self starts to weaken. Because if your thoughts arise due to conditions, if your emotions shift due to conditions, if your actions are influenced by conditions, then what exactly is this self that claims control over everything? This is where the teaching of anatta, or non-self, becomes deeply relevant. The Buddha did not say that you do not exist, but that the idea of a permanent, unchanging self is an illusion. What you call you is not a single entity, but a constantly changing process, a flow of experiences, perceptions, thoughts, and sensations that are always in motion. And yet, throughout your life, you have been trying to hold on to this idea of a fixed identity. You have been trying to define yourself, to stabilize yourself, to create a version of you that feels solid and consistent. But in doing so, you have been working against the very nature of reality. Because nothing in your experience is truly fixed. Your thoughts change, your feelings change, your desires change, your perspectives change. Even your sense of self changes depending on the situation, the environment, the people around you. And still, the mind tries to create continuity. It tries to say, this is who I am. It tries to hold on to a story, an identity, a narrative that feels stable. But when you look closely, that stability is constructed. It is maintained through memory, through repetition, through the constant effort to keep the story intact. And when something challenges that story, when something does not fit the identity you have built, you feel discomfort, confusion, even resistance. This is because the illusion of self is being threatened, and the mind reacts by trying to restore it. But what if there is nothing to restore? What if the sense of control you have been relying on is not as real as you believed? This realization can feel unsettling at first, because if you are not fully in control, if your identity is not fixed, if everything is constantly changing, then where do you find stability? Where do you find certainty? What can you hold on to? The instinct is to search for something solid. But Buddhism does not point you toward something to hold on to. It points you toward understanding. Understanding that the desire for control is what creates tension. Understanding that the attempt to stabilize what is inherently unstable is what creates suffering. Understanding that the self you are trying to protect is not something permanent, but something constructed. And when this understanding begins to deepen, something unexpected happens. The need to control starts to loosen. Not because you force it to, not because you decide to let go, but because you see that holding on does not bring the stability you were seeking. It only creates resistance against the natural flow of experience. You begin to notice that when you stop trying to control every outcome, there is less tension. When you stop trying to define yourself so rigidly, there is more space. When you allow thoughts, feelings, and experiences to arise and pass without clinging to them, there is a subtle sense of ease. This is not passivity. This is not giving up. This is alignment with reality. Because reality is not fixed. It is dynamic, constantly changing, always moving. And when you try to impose control on something that is constantly shifting, you create friction. But when you begin to move with it, to observe it, to understand it without trying to hold it in place, something shifts within you. You are no longer fighting against the nature of experience. You are seeing it as it is. And in that seeing, the illusion begins to dissolve. Not all at once, not completely, but gradually. As awareness continues to deepen, the sense of a rigid self starts to soften. The need to control every outcome begins to fade. The tension that once filled your mind becomes less intense, and in its place, there is something quieter, something more stable, not because it is fixed, but because it is not dependent on anything external. This is the beginning of true freedom in Buddhist understanding. Not freedom through control, but freedom from the need to control. Not freedom through building a stronger identity, but freedom from the attachment to identity. And as this realization continues to unfold, a new way of experiencing life begins to emerge. You are no longer trying to hold everything together. You are no longer trying to force reality into a shape that feels comfortable. You are simply observing, understanding, and allowing. And in that allowing, there is clarity. A clarity that does not come from thinking more, but from seeing more deeply. A clarity that reveals something you may have never fully considered before. That what you have been trying to protect, control, and define as yourself was never as solid as it seemed. And once this is truly seen, not just understood intellectually, but felt directly, something within you begins to release. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gently, like a grip that slowly opens after being held too tightly for too long. And in that opening, you begin to experience life without the constant need to control it. You begin to move through moments without trying to fix them. You begin to see yourself not as something rigid and defined, but as something fluid, changing, and deeply interconnected with everything around you. And from this perspective, a new question arises. If there is no fixed self to control everything, then what is left when you stop trying? And in that question, there is the doorway to a deeper understanding that goes beyond identity, beyond control, and beyond everything you once believed yourself to be. After the illusion of control begins to loosen and the idea of a fixed self starts to soften, there comes a phase that many people misunderstand, a phase that does not feel like progress in the way the mind expects, but is in fact one of the most important shifts in the entire journey. It is the phase where everything becomes quiet, not quiet on the outside, because the world continues as it always has. People speak, situations unfold, life moves forward without pause, but quiet within. A kind of stillness begins to appear, not because everything has been solved, but because the constant need to solve begins to fade. At first, this stillness can feel unfamiliar. The mind, which has spent so long analyzing, reacting, controlling, begins to notice that it no longer has the same intensity. Thoughts still arise, but they do not carry the same weight. Emotions still move through you, but they do not define you in the same way. There is space now, space that was not there before. And in that space, something important begins to reveal itself. You begin to see, not in the way you used to see, not through interpretation or judgment, but directly, without distortion, without the constant interference of thought trying to label and control every experience. You begin to observe your life as it unfolds, moment by moment, without needing to immediately react to it. This is what the Buddha pointed toward with mindfulness, not as a technique, but as a way of being, a state of awareness where you are fully present with what is happening without trying to change it, without trying to hold on to it, without trying to push it away. And when you begin to rest in this awareness, something shifts at a very deep level. The patterns that once controlled you begin to weaken, not because you are fighting them, but because you are no longer feeding them with unconscious attention. You are no longer reacting automatically. You are no longer identifying with every thought that arises. Instead, you are watching, and in watching, you begin to understand. You see how thoughts appear and disappear on their own. You see how emotions rise and fall like waves, never staying, never permanent. You see how experiences come and go, each one temporary, each one passing. And slowly this understanding becomes more than just an idea. It becomes something you feel directly. You begin to sense the impermanence of everything, not as a concept, but as a reality that is constantly unfolding. You see how nothing can be held onto, how nothing remains exactly the same, how everything is in a continuous state of change. And with this seeing, the need to cling begins to dissolve, not because you force yourself to let go, but because you understand that holding on does not make anything stay. It only creates tension against what is already changing. This is where a deeper form of peace begins to emerge. Not a peace that depends on circumstances being perfect, not a peace that requires everything to go your way, but a peace that comes from not resisting what is. A peace that exists even when things are uncertain. A peace that remains even when thoughts are present. A peace that does not come and go because it is not dependent on anything external. And in this peace, you begin to reconnect with something that has always been there. Your awareness itself, not the thoughts within awareness, not the emotions within awareness, but awareness as it is, clear, open, unchanged by what passes through it. This is not something you create. It is something you recognize. It has been there in every moment of your life, quietly observing, quietly present, even when you were completely lost in thought, even when you were deeply attached, even when you felt disconnected from yourself. It was always there. But now, for the first time, you begin to notice it, and this noticing changes everything. Because once you recognize that you are not the thoughts, not the emotions, not the shifting identity you have been trying to maintain, you begin to rest in something deeper, something that is not affected by the constant movement of the mind. This is what the Buddha pointed to as true understanding. Not understanding through concepts, but through direct experience. Seeing clearly that everything that arises will pass. Seeing clearly that clinging creates suffering. Seeing clearly that your true nature is not something that can be lost, only something that can be obscured. And as this clarity deepens, the layers that once covered your awareness begin to fall away more naturally. You no longer need to force change. You no longer need to struggle to become something different, because you see that the struggle itself was part of the illusion. You begin to move through life with less resistance. When something pleasant arises, you experience it fully without trying to hold on to it. When something unpleasant arises, you allow it to pass without trying to push it away. You remain present, aware, grounded in the understanding that everything is temporary. And in this way, life begins to feel different, not because the external world has changed, but because your relationship to it has changed. You are no longer caught in every thought. You are no longer defined by every emotion. You are no longer driven by the constant need to control. You are simply aware, and in that awareness, there is a sense of returning. Not returning to a place, not returning to a past version of yourself, but returning to what has always been beneath everything you have experienced. A quiet presence, a still awareness, a natural clarity that does not need to be created or maintained. And as you rest more deeply in this awareness, something else begins to fade. The sense of urgency, the constant feeling that you need to become something, achieve something, fix something in order to be complete. That urgency, which once drove so many of your actions, begins to lose its intensity because you begin to see that nothing was missing in the way you believed. What was missing was not something you needed to gain, it was something you needed to see. And now, as you begin to see more clearly, the search itself begins to quiet down. Not completely, not all at once, but gradually. As understanding deepens, you start to realize that the person you thought you lost was never truly gone. It was simply hidden beneath layers of thought, attachment, and misunderstanding. And now, those layers are no longer as strong as they once were. They begin to dissolve, not through effort, but through awareness. And in their place, there is something simple, something quiet, something that does not demand attention, does not seek validation, does not need to be defined. Just presence, just awareness, just this moment as it is. And in this moment, without needing anything to be different, without needing to hold on to anything, without needing to become anything, you begin to experience what it feels like to truly be here. Not lost, not searching, not becoming, just aware. And in that awareness, you are already whole. After awareness begins to stabilize and you start to rest more naturally within the space of observation rather than constant reaction, something subtle yet powerful starts to unfold within your experience, something that does not arrive suddenly but grows quietly, like a shift in the foundation of how you see everything. This is the beginning of true detachment, not the kind of detachment that comes from avoiding life or distancing yourself from people, but the kind that arises from understanding. A detachment that is not cold or indifferent, but clear and deeply grounded in awareness. It is not about withdrawing from the world, but about no longer being controlled by it. At first, this change may feel almost unnoticeable. You still move through your life. You still interact with people. You still experience thoughts and emotions. But something is different. There is a gap now, a space between what happens and how you respond. And within that space, you begin to see choices that were not visible before. The Buddha described this as the power of awareness, the ability to observe without immediately reacting, the ability to remain present without being pulled in every direction by desire and fear. And as this awareness deepens, your relationship with everything begins to change. You notice that you no longer react as quickly as you once did. Situations that used to disturb you now pass more lightly. Words that once affected you deeply now lose some of their weight. Not because you are forcing yourself to be unaffected, but because you understand that everything that arises is temporary, and this understanding creates freedom. Freedom from the need to respond to everything. Freedom from the need to defend every part of your identity. Freedom from the constant pressure to control how life unfolds. This is where a deeper strength begins to emerge. Not the strength of resistance, not the strength of holding everything together, but the strength of not being shaken so easily. A quiet stability that does not come from control, but from clarity. And as this stability grows, you begin to notice something else. The things you once held on to so tightly start to lose their grip on you. The need for constant validation begins to fade. The desire to be understood by everyone begins to soften. The fear of being alone begins to dissolve. Not completely, not instantly, but gradually. As you see more clearly the nature of these attachments, you begin to understand that much of what you were chasing was not truly necessary, that the approval you sought did not define your worth, that the relationships you clung to were often sustained by fear rather than genuine connection, that the identity you tried to maintain was not as real as you believed. And with this understanding, something within you begins to release, not through force, but through insight. You stop holding on so tightly. You stop trying to make everything permanent. You stop trying to build stability out of things that are constantly changing. And in this release, there is a sense of lightness, a feeling that you are no longer carrying as much weight as before. Because you are not. You are no longer carrying the constant need to prove yourself. You are no longer carrying the burden of trying to control every outcome. You are no longer carrying the pressure of maintaining an identity that never truly felt stable. And as this weight drops away, you begin to move differently. You begin to speak more honestly, not to impress, but to express. You begin to act more clearly, not to be accepted, but to be aligned with what you see as true. You begin to make choices not based on fear of loss, but based on understanding of what brings clarity and peace. And this is where your life begins to transform in a very real way. Not because the external world suddenly changes, but because your inner world is no longer reacting in the same patterns. You are no longer easily pulled into conflict. You are no longer constantly seeking reassurance. You are no longer dependent on outcomes to feel stable. Instead, you begin to experience a different kind of presence, a presence that is not trying to become something, a presence that is not trying to escape something, a presence that is simply here, aware, grounded and clear. The Buddha described this as liberation from suffering, not the absence of challenges, but the absence of unnecessary resistance. The understanding that pain may still arise, but suffering is created when the mind clings, resists, or identifies too strongly with what is passing. And now, as awareness continues to deepen, you begin to see this clearly. When a difficult emotion arises, you notice it without immediately becoming it. When a thought appears, you observe it without attaching your identity to it. When a situation unfolds, you respond from clarity rather than from conditioned reaction, and in doing so you begin to experience a kind of freedom that is not dependent on circumstances, a freedom that exists within you. This is not something dramatic. It does not announce itself loudly. It is quiet, stable, consistent, and because it is not based on external conditions, it is not easily shaken. You begin to realize that you can be at peace even when things are uncertain, that you can remain grounded even when others are not, that you can experience life fully without needing to control every part of it. And this realization changes how you move through the world. You become less reactive, but more aware, less attached, but more present, less controlled by fear, but more guided by clarity. And people may notice this change, not because you are trying to appear different, but because your presence carries a different energy. You are not seeking attention in the same way. You are not chasing approval in the same way. You are not reacting emotionally in the same way. And this creates a sense of quiet strength, a strength that does not need to be proven, a strength that does not depend on others recognizing it, a strength that exists simply because you are no longer fragmented within yourself. This is the power of detachment when it is rooted in understanding. It is not about pushing life away. It is about no longer being controlled by it. And as you continue on this path, something even deeper begins to settle within you, a sense of trust, not blind trust, not belief without understanding, but a quiet confidence in the nature of life itself. You begin to trust that everything arises and passes as it should. You begin to trust that you do not need to control every detail for things to unfold. You begin to trust that your awareness is enough to guide you through whatever comes. And this trust removes a great deal of fear, because fear often comes from the need to control what cannot be controlled. But when you see clearly that control was never as solid as it seemed, that everything is part of a larger flow of causes and conditions, you begin to relax into that flow, not passively, not without action, but without resistance. And in that relaxation, there is a deep sense of peace, not a temporary calm, not a moment of quiet, but a steady presence that remains even as life continues to move. This is where you begin to understand something that cannot be easily explained, that you were never truly trapped, that you were never truly lost, that what you experienced as suffering was the result of misunderstanding, of identification, of attachment to what is constantly changing. And now, as that understanding begins to dissolve, you are left with something much simpler: awareness, presence, clarity. And from this place, life no longer feels like something you have to fight against or control. It becomes something you experience fully, moment by moment, without needing to hold on to it. You still care, you still engage, you still live, but you do so without losing yourself in the process. And that is the true shift. Not escaping life, but living it without being consumed by it. Not avoiding attachment, but understanding it so deeply that it no longer binds you. Not becoming someone new, but seeing clearly enough to no longer be limited by what you thought you were. And as this continues to deepen, you begin to notice that there is nothing left to chase, nothing left to prove, nothing left to become in the way you once believed. Because what you were searching for was never outside of you. It was always here, covered, misunderstood, but never gone. And now you are beginning to see it clearly. And once it is seen, it cannot be unseen. And then, after everything begins to settle, after the noise of the mind has softened, after the attachments have loosened their grip, after the illusion of control has been seen through, there comes a moment that is not dramatic, not loud, not extraordinary in the way the mind expects, but deeply profound in a way that cannot be fully described. It is the moment where nothing new is added, yet everything changes. A quiet recognition begins to emerge, not as a thought, not as an idea, but as a direct knowing that does not need to be explained or proven. A knowing that feels more real than anything you have been chasing, more stable than anything you have been trying to hold on to. You begin to see not through effort, not through analysis, but simply because there is no longer anything in the way. And what you see is simple. You were never truly losing yourself. You were only losing your awareness of yourself. There is a difference, a profound difference, because what can be lost and what can be forgotten are not the same. The self you thought you were losing was never actually disappearing. It was never being destroyed, never being taken away, never being replaced. It was only being covered, layer by layer, by misunderstanding, by attachment, by identification with things that were never truly you. And now, as those layers begin to dissolve, not through force but through seeing, what remains is not something new, but something that has always been present, awareness itself, not as something you possess, but as something you are. This realization does not come with excitement. It does not come with overwhelming emotion. It comes with stillness, a deep, grounded stillness that feels more natural than anything you have experienced before, because it is not created, it is uncovered. And within this stillness, the need to search begins to fade completely, not because you have found something specific, not because you have reached a final destination, but because you see clearly that there was never anything missing in the way you believed. What you were searching for was not somewhere else. It was here, always here, hidden not by distance, but by distraction, covered not by absence, but by attention placed in the wrong direction. And now that attention has shifted, it is no longer lost in constant thought. It is no longer pulled by every desire or fear. It rests naturally in awareness itself. And in that resting, something becomes clear. There is no fixed self to protect, no identity that needs to be maintained, no version of you that must be defended or preserved, because everything you once believed yourself to be was part of a process, a flow, something that changes moment by moment, something that cannot be held in place no matter how much you try. The Buddha pointed to this not as something to fear, but as something to understand, because when you understand that there is no fixed self, the pressure to maintain one disappears. You no longer feel the need to constantly prove who you are. You no longer feel the need to protect an identity that was never stable to begin with. You no longer feel threatened when things change, because you see that change is not something happening to you, it is the nature of everything. And in this understanding there is a profound sense of ease, a sense that you are no longer resisting life. You are no longer trying to make it conform to your expectations. You are no longer holding on to what is already moving. You are simply present, fully, completely, without needing anything to be different. And this presence is not passive. It is deeply alive, it is clear, it is aware, it is engaged without being attached. You still experience joy, you still experience pain, you still move through the full range of human experience. But now there is no clinging, no resistance, no identification that turns these experiences into suffering. They arise, they are felt, they pass, and you remain, not as a fixed self, but as awareness, unchanging in the midst of constant change. This is the paradox the Buddha revealed, that what you truly are cannot be grasped, cannot be defined, cannot be reduced to a concept or an identity, and yet it is always present, always here, closer than anything you have ever known. And because of that, there is nothing you need to become, nothing you need to achieve, nothing you need to add to yourself in order to be complete. You are not incomplete. You were never incomplete. You were only unaware of what was already here. And now, that awareness has begun to return. Not fully perhaps, not permanently stabilized, but enough to change everything. Enough to show you that the path you were searching for is not ahead of you. It is within you, not as a direction, but as a recognition. And from this point, life begins to feel different in a way that is difficult to explain to others. Because the change is not external. It is not something that can be easily seen, but it is undeniable. You move differently. You respond differently. You experience differently. Not because you are trying to, but because your understanding has shifted at a fundamental level. You are no longer chasing fulfillment in the same way. You are no longer avoiding discomfort in the same way. You are no longer building your identity around things that are constantly changing. Instead, you are resting in something that does not need to change, something that does not come and go, something that has always been present, even when you were completely lost in thought, even when you were deeply attached, even when you felt disconnected from yourself. And this realization brings a kind of peace that is not dependent on circumstances, a peace that does not require everything to be perfect, a peace that remains even when life is uncertain, because it is not based on what is happening. It is based on seeing clearly. And when you see clearly, suffering begins to lose its foundation. Not because life becomes easy, but because you are no longer resisting its nature. You are no longer trying to make the impermanent permanent. You are no longer trying to define what cannot be fixed. You are no longer trying to hold on to what is already moving. And in that letting go, there is freedom, not a dramatic freedom, not something that feels like an escape, but a quiet, steady freedom that is always available when awareness is present. And from this place, a final understanding begins to emerge, one that is simple yet profound. You were never meant to become someone. You were meant to see clearly, to understand, to awaken, not into something new, but into what has always been here. And when that is seen, even for a moment, even briefly, even without full stability, it changes the direction of everything. Because once you see through the illusion, you cannot fully believe in it again. Once you recognize awareness, you cannot completely forget it. Once you understand the nature of attachment, you cannot hold on to things in the same way. Something has shifted, something has opened, something has awakened. And from that awakening, even if the mind continues, even if thoughts return, even if old patterns appear from time to time, there is now a deeper knowing beneath it all, a knowing that you are not lost, that you were never lost, that what you were searching for was never somewhere else. It was here, always here, waiting for you to stop running, waiting for you to stop searching, waiting for you to simply see. And now, you are beginning to see. And in that seeing, you are no longer losing yourself. You are finally remembering. So if something inside you has been quietly whispering, if there has been a feeling you couldn't explain, a sense that something is missing, a sense that you are not fully yourself, now you understand why. You were never broken. You were never truly lost. You were simply distracted, pulled away, slowly, gently, by thoughts, by attachments, by the illusion of who you believed you had to be. And now you are beginning to return, not to a place, not to a past version of yourself, but to awareness, to the only place where peace has always existed, right here, right now. So don't rush this process. Don't try to force change. Don't try to become someone new. Just begin to notice. Notice your thoughts without following them. Notice your emotions without becoming them. Notice your life as it unfolds without trying to control every moment. Because the moment you become aware, the transformation has already begun. And maybe this is not the end of losing yourself. Maybe this is the beginning of finally seeing who you are. If this message reached you, if something in you felt this, then take a moment, pause, breathe, and ask yourself honestly, am I living as my true self, or just who I've been conditioned to be? And if you're still here, you're not here by accident. Something in you is waking up, and this is only the beginning.